Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on storage devices. Now, real quick, when we want to talk about storage, in a previous lesson, we already talked about one type of storage, okay, and that is what we called volatile or short-term storage, okay, and that was in the lesson where we talked about memory or RAM. So that is also a component of storage, but that type of storage requires the presence of a continuous electrical charge to keep the data in place. What we're going to talk about in this lesson is more about the long-term storage. Okay, so various storage devices that can hold on to data. And notice, by the way, I say long-term, not permanent. Okay, we'll touch on that here and there as we go through the lesson, to where the data is not necessarily permanently on one of these storage devices, but it's there for the long term, and it does not require the electrical energy to be present to keep the data in place. So some of the stuff that we're going to talk about here in this lesson would be hard disks. I think by this point in time, I'm sure you've probably heard the term hard disk. My grandmother has probably heard the term hard disk at this point. But we'll also talk about optical disks, okay, so like CDs and DVDs, things like that. Removable. Now, technically, you could say that the optical media is removable. That's true. But we also still have good old-fashioned floppy disks. Good luck finding those. But we do have floppy disks. There's also things like tape storage and stuff like that. And then we have external storage, where now storage is not just inside the box, all right, or inside the main box, really, I should say, because I suppose it's always some kind of a box, but that box might be external to the actual computer itself. Now, real quick rundown here. This is something that I mentioned in a couple of previous lessons, just to make sure we understand storage capacity terminology. Basically, we have these things called bytes. And if we break down a byte even further, the smallest piece of data that we can have is actually something called a bit. Okay, and a bit is simply a 1 or a 0. Because truthfully, no matter what type of storage we're ever talking about, everything comes down to ones and zeros. Okay, it's all about electrical current, either on or off, or magnetic charge being either positive or negative. It's always about 1 or 0. Okay, and each one of those ones and zeros is a bit. If you take 8 of those bits and put them together, that's what makes up a byte. Now from there, if you take 1,000 of those bytes, and to be fully accurate in this, it would be 1,024 of those bytes, you end up with a kilobyte. Now the reason I mention 1,000, well, there's two reasons. Number one, the math is a lot easier, right? The math is a lot easier when you're multiplying something by 1,000 than when you're multiplying by 1,024. The second reason is because there are certain storage device manufacturers who will advertise capacity based upon, an even 1,000 multiple. Okay? And that's part of the reason why you will see a device, so let's take a hard disk, and let's say that you went out and bought a hard disk and it's supposed to be 100 gigabytes, and you install it in your computer and you format it, and just like that you have, and I don't know what the exact number is, but let's say you have 95 gigabytes instead of 100. Well, the reason why is because from a marketing perspective, they'll use 1,000 as the multiple to get to being able to say that there's 100 gigabytes. But when you do the actual math, you're supposed to use 1,024. So getting back to the chart that we have here, 1,024 bytes equals a kilobyte. Now, kilobytes is something that we haven't really dealt with in a long time. So if we multiply that again by 1,024, we say 1,024 kilobytes is a megabyte. Now, megabytes is a term that is still used in today's world, although it is quickly being considered to be extremely small storage. I mean, if you're in the megabytes range, that's really small storage. So if we multiply that by 1,024, 1,024 megabytes is then a gigabyte. That's where we are realistically at in the gigabyte era. Everything is measured in gigabytes. I mean, memories in gigabytes, hard drive capacities are in gigabytes. Now, I know you're already sitting there saying, well, wait a minute, gigabytes. I have a hard drive that's terabyte. Yes, we are in the early phases of moving from gigabytes being the norm to terabytes being the norm. And, well, guess what? A terabyte is 1,024 gigabytes. All right, so that's all I have listed for you here because that's where we're at today when it comes to storage. Now, I will tell you, when I say today, I'm saying in the commonplace. Okay, I'm saying by the regular average user, we're in the gigabytes and terabytes arena. The reality is that there are super high-end data centers out there that have storage that goes way beyond terabytes. And so I don't have it listed for you here on the screen, but just as a kind of a quick side note, if you take 1,024 terabytes, you end up with, and careful here, if you're thinking in your head a certain answer, a lot of people get this wrong because a lot of people think it's an exabyte. And the reality is that no, it's a petabyte. 1,024 terabytes is a petabyte, and then 1,024 petabytes is an exabyte. Okay, and the reason why is because there are a lot of things out there that have been publicized that they can go up to a certain amount of exabytes, and the term petabytes kind of got skipped over in some of those max quantities and things like that. And that's why we don't see it as much. But petabytes absolutely do exist, and somewhere in the near future, we are going to end up seeing petabyte drives. All right, so just keep that in mind. And by the way, there's a lot more that goes beyond that. I mean, there's zettabytes and yottabytes, and there's even one that I always get a kick out of. I'm not even sure if they've officially made this the name. I think they have at this point. I know when I first started looking it up, it wasn't the official title. It was just a thought of what they were going to name it. And it's something called a Brontobyte. And to me, if you're about the same age I am and grew up with the Flintstones, I don't know why, but Brontobyte, I always think of the Flintstones, which I find ironic considering the Flintstones is Stone Age, right? And now we're talking about Brontobyte, which is way into the future. Anyway, way off topic here. I just want you to understand how to do the math when it comes to storage capacities. Now let's actually go in and look at the specific types of storage. Now, the first one I'm going to throw at you here, I will tell you, is really almost more of a history lesson than it is anything that is currently used today. It's not to say that you won't find this in today's computers, but it's becoming extremely rare, and that is something called a floppy disk. Now, on the left side of the screen, I have two different types of floppy disks, and I will tell you that these are not the only two we had. Okay, the one at the bottom is a 5¼ inch floppy disk, and if you were actually holding it in your hand right now, guess what? It would be floppy. It actually is bendable, and that's where the term floppy disk came from, is because this is a very flexible disk. Now, I mentioned that there are more than just what I have on the screen. If you go further back in time, you actually have 8-inch floppy disks, and even beyond that, there are other types. But in the mainstream marketplace, 8-inch and then 5¼ inch, and then finally the one that I have at the top on the left side of the screen there is a 3½ inch floppy disk. And a lot of people got confused with this floppy disk because it's not floppy. If you were holding this in your hand right now, it would be solid. And if I was banging on the desk, which I don't have one in my hand or else I'd make the noise for you, if I was banging on the desk, it would actually make a banging noise. It's solid. The reason this is still considered to be a floppy disk is because only the casing that you're looking at, just that outer casing, is actually hard. Whereas the disk itself, if you were to slide that little metal bracket that's at the top of the disk I've illustrated there, if you slid that over, you would actually get to see the disk part itself where you actually read and write. And that's still a floppy disk, a bendable, flexible disk. To the right, I have a picture of a floppy drive and the floppy ribbon cable that is used to connect that drive. Typical storage of a 3½ inch floppy disk was 1.44 megabytes. Yes, that's right. I said basically 1½ megabytes. You see why floppy disks are almost pointless? I mean, you can't even put an MP3 on there, right? You can't even put most songs on there. There's not much you could put onto a floppy disk, and that's why you don't see these anymore. There were double-sided. Matter of fact, the one that's illustrated on the screen is a double-sided. I can tell because there's holes on the left and the right side of it. And that means it could hold 2.88, which means it could hold almost 3 megabytes. But again, pretty much obsolete. Okay, so this is more of a history lesson than something you're going to be dealing with in today's world. What you will be dealing with in today's world, and we have been for quite some time, and I think we will continue for quite some time into the future, although there is another version of this hard disk that I'm going to show you in just a little bit. But hard disks. Some people have asked me, they say, well, what makes this a hard disk versus the floppy disk, right? Because it's just the outer shell that's hard, right? Well, the answer is wrong. The inside actually has hard disk platters as well. Okay, so this is what you see on the outside, right? This is what you see when you go to the store and you buy one and you put it into your computer. But this is what you see if you were to take the cover off, which, by the way, you, for the most part, really shouldn't ever be doing. These days, so many computer parts are just disposable. It's more cost effective just to buy a new one than it would be to try to go in here and repair one. But if you did go inside, here is what it looks like. You have this thing called an actuator and an actuator arm, right? So the actuator is like a motor, and then you have the arm that kind of goes back and forth, if you can picture it. And at the end of the arm are your read-write heads, which are then reading and writing onto these platters, which are then kind of held in place and spun around by this spindle motor. If you were to flip this hard drive upside down and look at the other side, you'll see that there's a circuit board, you have a power connector, and we'll learn about the different types of power connectors because this is an example of a power connector that you'd have on an IDE hard drive, which we'll talk about that technology in just a moment, as well as the data connector, where there's a 40-pin ribbon cable that you would connect, and some jumpers, and I'll explain what those are for. All right, so today's hard drives are actually more commonly SATA, and that's another technology we'll talk about in just a moment, and it would look just a little bit different than this. Now, I'm not going to waste a lot of time here going through the actual ins and outs of how the actual technology works. The basics of it, though, are that if you picture here that you have, this is just an example of a platter. So those read-write heads that you saw at the end of the actuator arm, well, actually that arm, you saw it on top of the platter, but actually it goes both on top and on the bottom of the platter. So those platters are two-sided. And they use an analog magnetic field, or what becomes an analog electrical current that is used. And again, when it comes to magnetics, you have polarity, right? And you have, north and south polarity. Okay, or some say positive and negative polarity. And based upon which way the polarity is, you're going to create a 1 or a 0. And you switch the polarity through this thing called flux reversal. Now, beyond that, feel free to read up all about it if you really want to know what's going on inside of a hard drive. But that's the basic gist of it. What is important that you understand is the actual geometry of the hard disk. All right, so first of all, that platter that you saw, in most hard drives, it's not platter, but it's the plural. It's platters. There's multiple platters. Okay, so on that spindle, you end up with a stack of platters. And you have those actuator arms and read-write heads that go on top and underneath each one of them. So you have a bunch of arms going in and writing to all these various platters. Now, on these platters, I'm going to ask you to focus on the lower left-hand corner of the screen here, where I point out what a track is. Okay, so if you picture on any given platter, there is a track, right? And it's one line, basically, that goes all the way around the platter. If you go up to the top left portion of the screen, I point out that one section of the track is known as a sector. Now, I will tell you that this sometimes gets a little confusing because sometimes you'll see in different publications, you'll see like the entire pie piece, so to speak, all the way from the center all the way out to the edge as being a sector. And that's actually something known as a disk sector. Okay, but the sector, for the sake of the geometry here and some of the math, is just the one little piece on that track. From there, if you move to the right, you'll see I have something called a cluster, and it looks like, from the illustration, it looks like I'm highlighting two sectors, and that's not necessarily the case. A cluster has to do with the smallest amount of data that can be written to the disk. Okay, so depending on exactly how a disk is formatted and what file system you're using, there are different cluster sizes, and the cluster represents the smallest piece of data that can be written. And it is usually bigger than a sector. Okay, it might be a sector and a half, might be 2 sectors, might be 3, it could be any number of sectors. One thing I will tell you about a sector, by the way, is a sector is a finite amount of data. A sector holds 512 bytes of data. Okay, so that would be half of a kilobyte, right? Now, I should clarify that in a traditional hard drive, a sector holds 512 bytes. The reality is that there are certain hard drive technologies where that actually has been modified, but I don't want to go there. I just want to go with the standard. Just keep in mind the standard is 512 bytes. Now, the one last component that I want to point out to you here is in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, and it is something called a cylinder. A cylinder is basically if you take one of the tracks on a platter and have that same track on every platter going all the way down through the spindle. Okay, so some hard drives will say that they have X number of cylinders. Right? If you look at the specs on the hard drive, it'll say X number of platters, X number of cylinders. However many cylinders it says that it has, that's how many tracks are on each platter. Okay, so really the cylinder is just a track going down through all the platters. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons to using, these typical magnetic hard disks. I mean, as far as the pros, they can be fairly high capacity, right? In the sense that, I mentioned that we have terabyte drives, and you can get a terabyte drive for, I haven't priced it today, but I want to say, $50, $60 you can buy a terabyte of storage. So you can definitely get decent capacity at a low cost. They do come in different form factors, so many different shapes and sizes. You do have 3.5 inch, you have bigger 5.25 inch, you have 2.5 inch for your laptops. You have a lot of different shapes and sizes. Some of the cons is that it's vulnerable to EMI. Now, EMI stands for electromagnetic interference. So I don't know that it's very vulnerable to the actual interference, the way we typically think of EMI. But the bottom line is because it's magnetic, other magnetic things can cause problems. You ever want to erase a hard drive real fast? Put a high-powered magnet on it. So what is another con? They definitely can be damaged, and they do fail because there are a lot of moving parts. And as a whole, they're not the best performing drives. They're not the worst either. I will tell you the performance is going to have a lot to do with the speed, and that is one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that your typical hard disk will be rated as 5,400 RPMs. And if you picture that these disks are spinning, RPM is revolutions per minute or rotations per minute. A lot of people use a different word for the letter R there, but basically it's going to spin 5,400 times all the way around per minute. They come with 7,200 RPM, 10,000 RPM, and even some of the more expensive ones are 15,000 RPM. And I would say when you get to the point of a 15,000 RPM hard disk, that's going to perform pretty well. It's not that slow anymore. Now, I mentioned that I was going to talk to you about a different type of hard drive that you'll see in today's world. And actually, it's this type of hard drive that you're going to see a lot more of as we move into the future. Okay, so whereas right now today you still see a lot of the actual magnetic hard drives, little by little, as this new type of SSD, which is solid state drive, okay, these are the new types of hard disks that we're seeing out there. And as they start to grow in size, and as the price starts to come down, this is the type of hard drive that you're going to see moving into the future become commonplace. Okay, and again, right now they're not that big. Yes, on the screen here I'm showing you as big as a 512 gigabyte drive, and that's great. I mean, that is absolutely great. 512 gig. That's not that small, and that's great that we're already up to that size. But that 512 gig drive is probably going to cost you between $500 and $1,000, at least for a reputable name brand. Versus you could get double that. You could get a terabyte drive of a standard magnetic hard drive. What did I say, for probably like $50 or $60? All right, so that's what I'm talking about as far as why we don't see these used too much. Now, why do we want to use solid state hard drives? Well, first of all, there's no moving parts. Okay, nothing moves. It's all done with the circuitry and the electronics. You don't have motors. You don't have moving arms. So what's the benefit of that? Well, number one, doesn't break as easily. Number two, much, much, much faster performance. I mean, it is crazy how fast data can transfer back and forth from these solid state drives. Now, these drives also come in many different form factors. Okay, there's a 1.8 inch, 2.5 inch, and 3.5 inch. Those are the three standard sizes. Okay, and the idea here is they're trying to match up with the hard drives that we're used to using. A 3.5 inch drive is the typical hard drive that we would be looking at in a desktop computer. 2.5 inch standard size that we'd have for a laptop, and 1.8 inch for some of our smaller devices. Okay, so just keep in mind, SSD, it's the way of the future. It's lightning fast, very reliable. Although I should point out one thing when it comes to reliability. And I'll be interested to see, check back with me in 2 or 3 years. I want to see where we're at with things. But as far as the reliability of long-term data storage on an SSD, in the past, this basically uses the same technology and the same idea as your little SD cards. When we'll talk about SD cards in just a moment, but the little SD cards that you use to store digital pictures on. And they've always said in the past, don't keep your pictures on your SD card. The SD card was never designed for long-term storage. It was really designed for very fast storage, but not long-term reliability. Well, now that we're moving to these solid-state hard drives, and it's using basically the same technology, I want to see if they're maybe starting to determine that it can handle long-term storage, or if we're going to run into a situation where stuff starts to get corrupt over a certain shorter period of time. So we'll have to see. Now here is where we're going to get into some of the connectors and stuff that I was talking about. We would get into the technologies. I mentioned the hard drives. The first one we have here is the Parallel ATA interface, or PATA. Now I will tell you, all hard drives for the longest period were basically all considered to be ATA drives, which was basically synonymous with IDE and then EIDE. Basically IDE was ATA 1 and EIDE was ATA 2. I don't want you to worry too much about those specifics, but basically we had our ATA drives, and the reason we refer to them as PATA or PATA is because of something we're going to talk about next, which is that we now have serial ATA or SATA. And so to differentiate the two, we decided to call the original ATA PATA. But the bottom line is here, what you see circled on the screen here is the connection, and it's a 40-pin connector, and it uses a ribbon cable similar to the one you saw on the floppy drive. Matter of fact, if you look to the left of the circle, there's a black connector there, and that's a 34-pin connector. That's actually the floppy connection. Okay, so just a little side note there. When working with the original ATA drives, or the IDE or EIDE drives, you could put 2 drives on any one cable. So basically what you did was you daisy chained the two into what was called a master-slave scenario. Okay, one of the drives had to be set to master, one had to be set to slave. And that way they could go ahead and both communicate through the same IDE or EIDE controller. Now very often this was done through jumpers, and that's what I have illustrated for you here. Don't take what I have illustrated as being literal. You would have some kind of indication on the drive itself on how the jumper should be set if you wanted it to be a master, how it should be set if it should be a slave, and there was also a third setting called cable select. And that was an idea where rather than have to worry about, well, this drive's a master and this one's a slave, and do I have my jumper set up correctly? What if we just put all of our drives to cable select, and then depending on which port on the cable it was connected to, One would be the master and one would be the slave. All right, so that didn't always go over so well because you didn't always have the technology in place on the motherboard or the ribbon cable to support it, but that was an idea that was out there as well. What we do see more typically in today's world are the serial ATA or SATA hard drives. And what I have illustrated on the screen for you is on the motherboard there, those are the actual data connections. That's what they look like to plug in a SATA hard drive. And in the top right portion, the little call out there, that's what the power connector looks like for SATA. Now you'll get to see this a little bit more detailed when we get in and actually build the computer. But I can tell you that SATA hard drives, there's a couple of benefits to them over the PATA hard drives, and that is they're faster and you have no specific limitation on the number of hard drives that you can have. Okay, your only limitation is based upon the number of connections. And really should tell you that typically in an IDE or PATA type scenario, you typically could only have just the two controllers and then each of them could only have two hard drives. There were some scenarios where you could expand from there, but it was not normal. Okay, whereas with SATA, it's not uncommon at all to have, well, here's an example of a motherboard with 6 connections, and it's not difficult at all to add an expansion card with additional SATA connections. A third type of hard drive, and this is something that we used to see a lot more of, and you still see it, but you see it more in your high-end systems, is SCSI. Okay, SCSI. It's pronounced SCSI. Basically, this is also a daisy chain type solution where you'll have a controller, and then from there you'll have a ribbon cable, and you'll have multiple devices connected to it. And one of the things about when you're using SCSI is that you have to have terminators at the end of the daisy chain. Matter of fact, I should say at both ends of the daisy chain. So you'll notice in the illustration here that there's a SCSI terminator up at the top, and that's inside your box there, if you can kind of imagine my drawing here. And then you also have a terminator on the other end over on the left here, because you can also have an external device. Okay, you can have external devices as part of the SCSI chain as well. You also need to know that all SCSI devices must have something called a SCSI ID, and depending on the level of SCSI you're using, those IDs will be anywhere from 0 to 7 or 0 to 15. You should also keep in mind that the boot device, so if you have a hard drive that is meant to be the boot device, the one with the operating system on it that you're going to boot from, it should have a SCSI ID of 0, which means that it has the highest priority. And the controller itself will always have the lowest priority, which means it will have a SCSI ID setting of either 7 or 15, depending on the SCSI technology you're using. Now again, I'm not really going to go any deeper here into the SCSI technology and how it actually works, but what you do need to know is these SCSI ID settings, well, they can be done in a number of different ways. Okay, some devices will have an actual, kind of clicker on it, where you push a button to make the ID go up or down. You'll see the actual analog number in the window. And in some cases, you end up with dip switches, where you have a bank of 4 switches. And again, if you're using an older SCSI device with older technology where you could only have the 8 devices, then you would only have 3 dip switches. Okay, and the reason why is because, and this is just binary stuff, but if everything was to off, that would be 0. And if you had 3 on, that would be SCSI ID 7, as I've illustrated here. With a bank of 4, you actually, and I'll tell you what, I have it illustrated here with the jumpers. Okay, so that's the other option that you have. With 4, you can go all the way from 0 to 15. All right, so just keep in mind that this is how the SCSI IDs are set. Now moving forward into our optical drives. CDs, DVDs, all that stuff. Here's the deal. Here's a little illustration for you. You got your polycarbonate layer, your lacquer layer, your aluminum layer, and inside there you got these burn pits. How is this all done? It's all done with lasers. Okay, so it's no longer magnetic. That's the main thing. You're talking about optical lasers here. I'm not worried right now about you understanding how these lasers actually make the ones and zeros appear on the disc. Again, feel free to read up all about it if that's what you're into. What I do want you to know, however, is what the different types of optical drives are. You first of all have your CD drive, right? Your compact disc drive. We have our CD-ROM, okay, which is ROM stands for read-only memory. Okay, so that basically means you have a CD-ROM, right? You went out and got a disc with music on it. You can read it, but that's it. You can't write to it. You can read to it. That's it. We have CD-R, and the R stands for recordable, and that means that you can what's called burn information onto the CD, okay, or you can record onto the CD, but you can only do it once. Once it's been recorded to, that's it. It essentially goes from being a CD-R to becoming a CD-ROM, right? Because it's been burned to, it's been written to, it's been recorded on, and it's been what's called finalized, which means that's it. It's done. Unless you, of course, have a CD-RW, which is rewritable, okay? And that means that you actually can write to this disk, and then you can actually erase and write again to the disk. Your CD storage capacity is typically 650 megabytes. That's considered to be too small for most things in today's world. So we then move on to this thing called the DVD, which has an interesting story behind it because it was originally called a digital video disc, but then it was argued that you could do more than just video. So then they wanted to call it the digital versatile disc. And eventually, the official name just became DVD. So rather than worry about what the letters actually stand for, it's a DVD. Don't worry what the letters stand for. So again, we have our DVD-ROM, okay, which means if you have a DVD-ROM, it's like you went out and you bought a movie, and that's it. You can read it. That's it. That's all you can do with it. Now, when you get to the recordable ones, right, you have the DVD-R, but it's DVD minus R and DVD plus R. And this basically had to do with something called the DVD Forum, created a standard called DVD minus R, and the DVD Alliance came out with something called the plus R. And originally, these were two different standards that, well, they still are two different standards, but you know, they served different purposes. One was theoretically better for data, one was theoretically better for video, and some will still argue that point today. But the bottom line is that almost all DVD players, whether it's the type that you have hooked up to your TV at home or whether it's the type you have in your computer, they will fully support both standards. So again, the DVD-R is where you can record, but you can only record once. Whereas you have the DVD-RW, which is where you can record and erase and record again. Now, the other thing is the storage. A DVD stores 4.7 gigabytes of data, but that's if you have just a single-sided, but there's also double-sided. And again, that's also if you have what's called single layer, and there's also something called double layer. Okay, so keep in mind that if you want to get real fancy with double-sided, double-layer DVDs, you can get quite a bit of storage. And then we finally move to our Blu-ray disc, or BD. And again, we have our BD-ROMs, we have our BDRs, and then instead of BDRW, they decided to call it BDRE, which stands for record and erase. It's the same idea, though. Okay, you have the read-only, you have the one that you can record once, and then you have the kind that you can record multiple times. What is Blu-ray? Well, Blu-ray is, of course, high def, right? It's the high def standard. And again, we have our single layer and our double layer. And with Blu-ray, here's the thing. A standard disc, a standard Blu-ray disc can support up to 25 gigabytes of data, so quite a bit. And the reason why we need all that is because, well, again, high def video uses up a lot of space. If you go to a double layer, you can double that. You can get to 50 gig. There are also mini disc versions that you'll find in certain home, camcorder type things, right? Video cameras, where you have a smaller version of it. And even those can support 7.8 gig with a single layer or 15.6 gig with a double layer. All right, so that's Blu-ray, and that's pretty much our optical discs. Now, if we move to our external disk drives, first of all, why? Why do we have external disk drives? Well, keep in mind, what I have on the screen here is a little bit deceiving because I suppose I'm illustrating a smashed up internal magnetic hard drive. The fact of the matter is this could have been internal or external. Okay, because most of the storage that we've talked about can be internal or now also has an external connection capability. The point I guess I'm trying to illustrate is that rather than keeping data in one place and just have it inside your computer, sometimes it's not a bad idea to also have it duplicated out, or some might say backed up, to an external device. But an external device also allows you to take data and move it from computer to computer very easily. Move large quantities of data from one person to another. Now there's many different connections that we can use for the external devices. There is something called eSATA, which is external SATA. So if you have a SATA drive, you can actually connect not just internally, but you can also have an external connection. There's USB, which is what's actually illustrated on the drive that's on the screen. The one thing I will tell you is if you have, let's say, a PATA hard drive, right? You have your parallel ATA drive or your IDE drive. There are external USB casings that you can buy that you can put that ATA drive inside of, and it converts it then into a USB connection to turn it into an external drive on your computer. We also have IEEE 1394A, otherwise known as FireWire. And then we have SCSI, which I had mentioned a few moments ago. We have external capabilities. Please keep in mind that this also includes optical drives, okay, not just the actual hard drives themselves. You can have external CD, DVD drives, things like that. Flash drives. Hey, I mentioned this a little while ago, right? I mentioned the SD cards, right? Well, here's a picture of a fairly typical, like, all-in-one reader, because there's all these different types of external flash card media types. Sony had their own exclusive, like memory stick. Well, basically the idea here is, yeah, there are a number of different types, but in today's world, it's all evolving to the SD card. Okay, it's all evolving just into your standard SD card. And from there, I will tell you, besides SD cards, you also want to be familiar with your mini and your micro SD cards. Not so much for the PCs themselves, but where we see our mini and our micro SD cards is on our tablets and on our phones. You see them all over the place. And you may want to be able to quickly and easily transfer data back and forth between your tablet and your phone and your computer. And that's why you need to have a card reader that can support this. Now, there's all sorts of adapters that you can use. There's a very typical adapter where you take a micro SD card and you end up putting it in a casing, or sometimes you slide it in the back of what looks like a standard SD card. But all it is it's a shell so that it'll fit into your SD card reader on your computer. There's also real common USB converters as well, where you take your SD card, you pop it into a little casing that then plugs into a USB port. All sorts of different options out there, but this is a great way to transfer data very quickly. Okay, again, USB drives. One thing I want to mention, and it's not just the USB drives, but as a whole, when it comes to external data, keep in mind that although there are benefits to having external data, there are also potential security risks with external data. Once the data leaves the box, and especially if it's being handed off from one person to another, it could end up in the wrong hands. So there are various security technologies that you can also build into this external media to help keep your data secure. Now there's one other type of external storage. There's actually different versions of this, but I figured I'd throw this one out there. Network attached storage. And this is the idea where you have storage You have this file-based storage system that is out on a network, and that's what I mean by IP-based. It's an actual piece of storage that has an IP address, and it's Ethernet attached, meaning it is attached via your Ethernet network. Okay, it's actually connected via RJ45 connector on Ethernet cable, and it's more often than not appliance-based. In other words, it's specifically a NAS device. It's not a computer. It is an external piece of storage that is listed as a NAS device. Okay, but the point is, you can have storage out on the network. And that is something that you're seeing more and more of. Storage options are getting to be super crazy, especially with everything moving to, and I am making air quotes right now, the cloud. Okay, so storage is being put out into the cloud, both privately and publicly, as far as the private cloud, public cloud. I don't want to get completely off base here, but I just want you to understand that storage is not, considered to be something that you just keep inside the computer anymore. Now, when it comes to backup, and really I shouldn't call this backup, I should probably put more like high availability or something like that here. First, again, more of a history lesson than anything else, we could talk about tape drives or tape storage. This is what we used for many, many years exclusively, or almost exclusively, for backups. The reason why is because you could very cost effectively store a lot of data on a tape. The second reason is that a tape is considered to have a very long lifespan. In other words, tapes last a very long time. They're very reliable. Even if something happens to a tape, it may happen to one piece of the tape, but all the rest of your data might be fine. Okay? Tape is still considered to be very, very reliable form of archived storage. There are all sorts of various tape drive technologies that are out there, and if I were doing this class for you 10 years ago, I'd be asking you to learn about all of them. Whereas in today's world, I'll just mention if you want to use tape storage, look at what's available, look at the technology, look at the speed, look at the storage capacity. Those are the two main things. How much can you store and how fast and for how much money? What I will tell you is that these days, backup storage is very often done either through some form of NAS, or there's also SANs, storage area networks. There's cloud-based solutions. Many people will just simply take an external SATA drive and they'll just copy to that. Okay, there's a lot of different storage options, and most of today's operating systems will support a variety of different backup storage. Now, the reason I say that I wanted to call this section more of high availability is this is not about backup, but about keeping your data, sound. And I want to talk to you about something called RAID. And the idea here is, well, hard drives do break, right? We've already said, boom, these things can blow up. They can actually crash. It's actually called a hard drive crash. The motor can crash. You can lose a bearing, and the arms will suddenly go and scrape the drives and destroy them. So RAID is an idea where we take, and just take a look here. What does it look like I have on the screen? Looks like I have a bunch of hard drives, right? Well, guess what? That's what it is. It's just a bunch of hard disks. But with RAID, what we can do is take this bunch of hard disks, and by the way, RAID stands for Redundant Array of Independent Disks. And although they are physically, in this illustration here, 4 different disks, logically, we look at it as one piece of storage. Okay, we take that bunch of disks, and we have them all work together to be one logical piece of storage. So let's talk about the different levels of RAID. And I will tell you, by the way, there's more than just what I'm going to show you here. Okay, these are the main ones. Sure, I'll be honest with you, I based this primarily off of the objectives for the A+ exam, but these are also the most commonly used ones out there. All right, so here we have our bunch of disks, right? Let's talk about RAID 0, which is known as striping. In order to have RAID 0, you have to have at least 2 physical disks. And again, even though they are 2 physical disks, they will look like one logical piece of storage. And you can have more than 2, by the way. The illustration I have here is 2 because that's the minimum, but you can have 3 or 4 or 5. You can have many more. So if we say that we have data that needs to be written, right? And that data gets broken down into these blocks that are going to be written to a hard disk. What we do with RAID 0 is we stripe the data back and forth between the two drives. Or if there were 3 drives, we'd be going 1, 2, 3 between the 3 different drives and then going back to 1. Now here's the deal. This does add performance. And it's not write performance necessarily, but read performance is really where you get the benefit. Because when you're reading this data back, you can actually read the data back from both hard drives at the same time and improve, how fast you can read the data in. Because instead of just having one disk that's doing all the work, trying to feed you the data, you can have 2 of them doing the work. So there's no actual redundancy. There's no reliability here. There's no high availability here with RAID 0. But that is a very common form of RAID. Where we do have redundancy is with RAID level 1, which is known as mirroring. Now with RAID level 1, you will have exactly 2 disks, but again, they're acting as just one single logical drive. Here we have that same data, but in this case, what we're going to do is each piece of data, each block of data is being written to both drives to create a mirrored image. So that way, if one drive was to fail, the data still exists on the other drive, and that's why you have redundancy. Now, I also mentioned high performance, and the reason why is because there are now technologies that have been built into where you can be reading block 1 from the one drive while you're reading block 2 from the other drive, and therefore, again, utilize both drives' performance to speed up the reading capability. Now, before we go into another level of RAID, I figured I'll mention there is where you can do a combination of more than one level of RAID. And we have what's called RAID level 10, as it's commonly known. But please keep in mind that RAID level 10 is actually not a level. It's RAID 1 and 0. And believe it or not, there's actually a slightly different version that is RAID 0 and 1. And the only difference between RAID 1.0 versus RAID 0.1 is whether you are doing a stripe of mirrors or a mirror of stripes. And if you look at the illustration, you'll see with RAID level 10, or 1.0, you end up with 2 mirrors that you then stripe the data back and forth between. Whereas with RAID 0.1, you end up with 2 stripes that you're striping data back and forth between, and those 2 stripes are then mirrored, a mirrored image of one another. All right? So keep in mind that you can do that. The last level of RAID that I want to talk to you about is something called RAID level 5. And this is a very popular form of RAID. And this is called striping with parity. In this case, you have to have at least 3 disks. You can have more, but you have to have at least 3. So if we take these 3 disks, again, representing one single logical drive, if we take our data, what's going to happen is that first block will be written to one drive. The second block will be written to the second drive, but then the third drive doesn't actually get data. You end up creating what's called a parity block that we throw onto that third drive. And we do that each time we stripe through the data. But we move the parity block. So now we're going to put 3 on disk 1 here, and then we're going to throw the parity block on disk 2 and put 4 on 3. And then we're going to, this stripe through will start off with parity, and then we'll do 5. And we'll do 6. Okay, so you see how that goes there? The idea here is if one of the drives fails, the parity block, and I'm not going to go into all the details about this, but the parity block can be used to reconstruct the missing data from the failed drive. And I will tell you that with RAID level 5, you get redundancy, as you can see here with the parity block. You get performance because you are striping. Now, I will tell you, there's actually a performance decrease on the right side of things because you have to do the formula for the parity. Okay, so the right side, not left and right, but right with a W, W-R-I-T. When you're writing, you have writing performance that'll slow down because you have to calculate parity. But the read performance, you are still getting to take advantage of the fact that the data is striped and you can read off multiple disks at the same time. But a third benefit that you have, even beyond mirroring, is see, here's the one huge drawback to using disk mirroring or RAID level 1. You only get to use 50% of the hard disk space that you spent your money on. right? In other words, if you bought two 100 gigabyte hard drives and you did mirroring on those two drives, you have a total of 200 gigabytes of storage, but you can only utilize 100 of it, right? Because anything you write to one, you're also going to duplicate and write to the other. So you only get 50% disk space utilization. Whereas with RAID 5, if I use this example here with 3 disks, if those were each 100 gigabyte hard drives, we have a grand total of 300 gigabytes of storage that we purchased, but we can only store on 200 of the 300, right? Because 1/3 will be held aside for parity. But there you're getting 66% disk space utilization, right? You get 2/3. Imagine if this was 4 disks. Now you'd get 75% disk space utilization because only one disk would have parity. So 3 of the 4 you'd get to use. Or what if you had 10 of these disks? Now 90% of your disk space you actually get to store data, and only 10% is left with parity. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with here before we wrap things up is keeping in mind that the scenario where you can bring multiple RAID together, you can also have RAID 51 or RAID 15. Again, we tend to put the numbers together and just say 51 or 15. It's really 5.1 or 1.5. And again, it's the idea of doing the same thing as 1.0 and 0.1. You can do striping with parity and then actually take that stripe and mirror it. Or you can go the other way around, where you can go ahead and you can have multiple mirrors representing each component of the stripe. All right, so that's how RAID works. And I will tell you that that does bring us to the end of this very long lesson. But to be honest with you, there's a lot of storage options out there, and you have to be familiar with all of it. All right, so if you need to, go back, watch any of this again. But the idea here is storage. In this lesson, we're talking about long-term, not permanent, right? Because things do break. But long-term storage or non-volatile storage, okay, in the form of floppy disks, which are kind of outdated. You have hard disks, which are obviously in today's world and will be into the future, whether it be magnetic or SSD. We have our optical drives. That's also something that is little by little being phased out, but it's going to be quite some time, I think, before optical storage is completely phased out. And then keep in mind that storage can be internal. It can also be external. We have all sorts of different technologies for connections, and you have to know all of it. So with that, brings us to the end of this lesson. I thank you for watching this lesson. Whew, that was a long one. Go get a cup of coffee, and I'll see you in the next lesson.